Thanks so much for joining us for our presentation, Getting Training Online Quickly. Just a friendly reminder that this is strictly an informational webinar and it cannot be used for continuing education credit. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. The webinar is being recorded and we'll provide you that recording as well as the slides via email. If you experience any technical difficulties today, we'd ask that you use the questions function. It's generally found on the right-hand side of your screen to message us privately. You're also welcome to ask any questions using that same questions feature throughout the entire presentation. So you don't need to wait till the end to ask your question. You can just chime in anytime and we'll try to answer all of the questions as best we can before we conclude today. Lastly, there'll be a short survey at the end of the webinar and your feedback would certainly be appreciated. So my name is Carol. I'm a marketing manager here at Vector Solutions and I'll be your webinar moderator today. And now I'd like to introduce our host and presenter, the one and only Jeff Dalto.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody out there. Thanks for stopping in and giving us a little time. We're going to give you a little bit of tips about getting training online quickly, and in particular doing it so because of COVID-19. My name is Jeff Dalto. I'm a learning and performance instructional designer kind of person. I've been doing this for about 20 years in a manufacturing context. My email is on the screen, jeff.dalto@vectorsolutions.com. I welcome any kind of emails after the webinar if you have more questions, so feel free to keep in contact. I'm also available on LinkedIn, and feel free to connect with me there as well. So briefly, here's what we're going to discuss. We're going to explain why people might have some interest in online training. We're going to talk about what exactly online training is, whether or not online training works, taking a look at some data and meta studies on that. A couple ideas around blended learning and some blended learning models, which I've kind of been borrowing from some different learning professionals. Some tips for specific different kinds of online training activity types, and then some final tips for getting started if you're just starting this now. This is going to be pretty. We're only together for 45 minutes or an hour with questions. It's going to be pretty general and intended for all audiences. So if after this webinar you want to dig deeper into training for a specific purpose, we've had multiple recent webinars about these kind of things. So on the screen are shortened bit.ly URLs for a hour-long webinar on online safety training, another one on online manufacturing training, another one on online maintenance training. And in addition, we have many guides from the Convergence Training blog you can check out as well. And here, the shortened URLs, we're going to try to get these into the follow-up email along with the recording and the PowerPoint. But you can get these from the recording as well. So if these are helpful, these are about 60 pages each. So why online training, right, Carol?
Yeah, Jeff, I guess, really to get us started, why should people use or at least consider online training in general and maybe right now especially?
Yeah, and that's a good breakdown of two different sets of reasons. So, the standard set, let me move this little, apologies if that's just, there we go. The standard set of ideas for many companies for online training have been the same for years. One is that it's so much more scalable. So you don't have to go out and just train 10 people. You can train 100 people at 5 different sites in a geographically dispersed locations. You get a consistent training message so that the online training is saying the exact same thing every time. If I did this webinar tomorrow, I would say different things. And if you had multiple trainers all trying to do this webinar tomorrow, the inconsistencies would be even greater. There's a benefit of lower cost to online training, including not pulling people off the job all at the same time and the travel expenses and all of that. It's really useful for remote workforces, which obviously is become more common this last couple months. And another thing is you get a lot of benefits from visual learning with online training. There are other benefits as well. You can let people practice in a safe and risk-free environment and so on. but these are kind of the standard benefits. Obviously, in the last few years, technology has just made this a lot easier and a lot more accessible. Not just is it increasingly common for people to have computers at work, but tablets. A lot of people have mobile phones that you can do this with. The internet is a lot better, and the data capacity is a lot better. So the technology is just making it easier and easier to use this at work. And then something we'll come back to over time, you can use online training in a blended learning solution to get improved learning outcomes. And we'll show you some studies on that, showing that it leads to better learning outcomes and ultimately to better workplace performance for your workers. And then most specifically, Carol, this last issue, as everybody knows, COVID-19 came about. It's difficult to lead training, instructor-led training, when your workers are working from home in some cases. It's potentially hazardous to lead instructor-led training when people are at your site, because maybe you can't get 6 feet apart, or maybe you're concerned that the virus could be aerosolized in a way, and so it's not just a 6-foot radius, but maybe a 20-foot radius, and those issues are still, I think, open and being investigated. It's another way to maybe not have training where people are using hands-on exercises and passing things around and possibly passing contagion around as well. So obviously COVID-19 has made this a bigger issue, and a lot of companies have been moving to online training as a result of COVID-19.
All right, Jeff, let's launch a kind of quick poll around that. So you'll see now on the screen to your right, all of our attendees out there. So is your organization currently using online training? And it's a no, yes for less than half of your training, or yes for more than half of your training.
Yeah, this will be interesting to see.
Yeah, it's already coming in. About 57% say yes for less than half.
Okay.
And then we're going to launch a second poll here in a moment. And that one will kind of be more around the circumstances of our current state. Very interesting. Yeah, we had about 58% say yes for less than half of the training, 31% for more than half, and about 12% not at all.
Oh, interesting. All right,
Yeah.
thanks. I can't see the results, Carol, so thanks for reading those.
Okay, no problem. And then for this next poll, and again, this one's a little more focused around COVID. So is your organization considering using more online training due to COVID-19? And it looks like the answer here is very unanimous. We've got almost 88% of you saying yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
understandably, but yeah, that's a big number.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Do you want to move forward?
Will do. All right, thanks for that, everybody. Interesting to learn.
Yeah, thanks for your responses.
So we're going to talk about what online training is, and it may not be quite as simple as it appears at the beginning, which is, I think, is nice, because it gives you a lot more options about what you can do. So some kind of things that you can deliver, or some ways you could deliver online training. It could be something as simple as a PDF or your PowerPoint. It could be a video. If you're getting into newer technologies, you can use chatbots, augmented reality, virtual reality. But three things that are going to be a big part of it are webinars, like something we're doing now, a virtual classroom, which is distinct and different than a webinar, and we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly, and then an e-learning course. So there's a lot you can do under that umbrella of online training. And so you've got a lot of options. And again, when you start to think about blended learning, remember you've got all these options, plus possibly some kind of instructor-led training in the future, or even now. And then there's a lot of different ways that you can deliver your online training. And you know, it could be something as simple as sending out emails, especially if you're trying to make a transition quickly right now. You can send online training to people through text messages. I've actually been going through, I signed up for a online course. I get a text every week, and I really enjoyed that experience. I just completed 12 weeks of that. There are messaging services, and then a whole bunch of websites. You can use things like blogging platforms like Blogger or WordPress to do that kind of stuff. There's all sorts of workplace communication and collaboration tools like Slack and Trello, Jira, and all these kind of things that you could use. And then there's kind of the standard, industry standard is the Learning Management System, or LMS. And so you've got a lot of options. And I guess one tip I'd give you right off the bat is, and I'll talk about this again later as well, but it's probably a good idea if you're going to try to get training online quickly right now, use some technology you have today and that your workers and coworkers are familiar with using today for delivery. You know, and sorry, flashing back to that poll for some reason. If email is available and people use it, great. If you have SharePoint and people know how to use it, great. If you've got a workplace communication program like Slack or Jira or Trello that people have been using, that's a good alternative. Now, at some point, you might decide that for your organization, you'd like to get a learning management system or LMS, which has like lots of benefits for compliance purposes and delivery and tracking and reporting and all that. And there's no reason to not consider that at some future point, but I wouldn't try to start like creating online training and implement an LMS all this 1 week. So maybe start in stages, and we'll talk more about that. But there's a lot of ways to deliver it. Maybe go with something that's easy and that people are familiar with this week. Now, in addition, obviously, you're going to have to think about a lot of additional technology. Some of these things will be installed on your network computer or available on the cloud, so you'll need to figure that out. Obviously, you and your remote workforce need access to the internet. Everyone's going to need computers or possibly mobile devices to watch this kind of stuff. And then if you're going to be building your own e-learning courses, you'll need a product called an e-learning authoring tool. We'll talk about that as well. So some tech. And then we found these two polls really interesting. These came from Brandon Hall, the Learning Research Organization. And the first poll was asking, how are people converting their instructor-led training as of March 30th? And then the second poll is the same question, but like a week or two later. And you see what companies originally were doing was switching to webinars primarily, like we're doing now, conference calls, so literally on a phone, e-learning a little less, videos, and then another thing I want to call out is VILT. That's the virtual instructor-led training or virtual classrooms we're talking about. So you see that's quite far down on the list. Podcast is something I haven't talked about. That's something to keep in mind as well, another effective way. And then, so how far is that? It's only like 2 days different. Look at e-learning has really jumped up to the top of the list here. And then we still have webinars. We're still doing conference calls, video learning. That virtual instructor-led training has increased. So it was interesting to see that most people that are really focusing on webinars, e-learning, you know, conference calls, which sounds like maybe not the best way to do online training, but you know, in an emergency, you do what you can, implementing video and so on. And Carol, do we have another poll at this point?
Yes, so after kind of looking at that data from Brandon Hall, we'd like to ask you all out there, what types of online training materials might you consider or your organization consider to use in the future? PDFs and PowerPoints, videos, webinars and virtual classrooms, or e-learning courses? Oh, very interesting.
What do they have to say, Carol?
We've got a predominant, we're almost at 50% voting for e-learning courses, about 38% webinars and virtual classrooms, hardly any for PDFs and PowerPoints, and about 12% for video. Very
All
interesting.
right, so yeah, we'll talk about all that a little bit more. We'll talk about e-learning, including how you can make some of your own, and I have some tips from you from a learning researcher about that. We'll talk more about the difference between webinars and virtual learning, and I'm going to encourage you guys to use virtual learning when you can, or virtual classrooms. I would also encourage you not to ignore PDFs and PowerPoints, but I have some tips for that as well. There's a great series of articles right now being written by Patty Shank, Dr. Patty Shank, on using asynchronous and synchronous learning and championing some of those PDFs. Anyway, a lot to talk about there. Very interesting.
Okay, Jeff, so if we have to get down to it, in a nutshell, does it work?
Right, and the answer is never as simple as yes or no. You can create training in any kind of different format, and you can design it well, and you can design it poorly. And so, you know, if you design it well, it'll work, and if you design it poorly, it won't. And that's true of online training as well. But before I really answer the question and show you some results based on studies, I want to make a distinction between the training delivery method, you know, instructor-led training, online training, virtual reality, any of those things, and the instructional method. What do you do within that training that's intended to help people learn? Provide practice, show demonstrations, use visuals, offer mnemonic devices, ask people to reflect upon what they've learned, and ask people to put it into their own words, and so on. The training delivery method itself, as I'm representing here, when I eat a chocolate chip cookie, it's all about the chocolate chips to me. The dough is the delivery method, and the chocolate chip is the active part that's doing good things for Jeff Delta. And in training, it's basically the same thing. The training delivery method, whether or not it's online or instructor-led, that doesn't actually directly affect whether or not people learn, whether or not people apply things on a job, whether or not people actually have behavior change. What does are those instructional methods. Some of those I just talked about: practice, reinforcement-based learning, visuals. That's where you get your educational or training or workplace performance improvement bang for your buck. And so when you're selecting a training delivery method, don't get hung up on the delivery method per se, but select a delivery method that allows you to embed the appropriate instructional methods you need for the learning outcomes you're looking for. So the learning researcher Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark, in her book Evidence-Based Training Methods, went through a whole bunch of studies and meta studies, and just highlighting the blue text here. There are no major differences in learning from classroom lessons compared to electronic distance learning lessons. The psychologically active ingredients of your lessons are what cause people to learn, regardless of what media you're using. So we're talking about those instructional methods again. And then her closing tips: you will find more fertile ground by using a blend of media that allows you to space out learning events, provide post-training performance support, and foster synchronous and asynchronous forms of collaboration. So calling out a couple of things here. She's calling for a blend. We'll talk about this more. Spacing out learning events over time. The practice is called spaced practice or spaced learning. We'll talk about that. Post-training performance support. This is really critical as well, and trainers can often forget that part. That, you know, your job's not done when people close the e-learning course or leave the classroom. And then fostering synchronous and asynchronous forms of collaboration. So some tips to keep in mind. And there's also a really great white paper by Dr. Will Thalheimer. It's called something like "Is E-Learning Effective?" What the research shows, which backs that up. And we've interviewed him at the Convergent Training blog if you want to check that out as well on that topic. A quick review about, as you're picking these instructional methods that will actually lead to better learning and better workplace performance improvements, a quick review here about how people learn. We're constantly bombarded by all this sensory stimuli from the external world, and our brains filter most of that out. And there's this thing called the sensory memory that's doing that filtering. This is entirely unconscious. It happens super quickly. You're not aware of it. And so most of that stuff is filtered out. So as a training designer, your first job is to, get past that hurdle and make sure people are actually pay attention to those important things. Next, once we're actually thinking of something, we're aware of it, it's in our working memory. We're consciously thinking about it. And we can only consciously think about maybe 3 or 4 things. And if we don't start making connections with the working memory, and the next thing I'll talk about, the long-term memory, that stuff we'll lose that in 20 or 30 seconds, and it's just gone. So when that information is in working memory, simultaneously, actually, the long-term memory is prompted, and it begins trying to make sense of that new information in working memory by comparing it to what it knows in related information in long-term memory. And it starts making very weak neural connections between neurons at that point. And over time, what you want to do is continue to strengthen those neural connections. That initial connection is nice, but it's not enough for long-term retention. And that's going to be one of your jobs is making that connection between working memory and long-term memory and strengthening it over time and making sure that doesn't degrade. And then ideally, people have these things in long-term memory in these little packets called schemas. And then you need to help them transfer that to the job. So this is the basic process as a training designer you're working through. How can I get past sensory memory? How can I not overload working memory? When people are in working memory, how can I awaken their prior knowledge from long-term memory? How can I start having them practice to strengthen those neural connections? What can I do to support them after training so they're more likely to transfer it on the job? And this is beyond the scope of this webinar to go into detail, but learning researchers have found a bunch of evidence-based training methods where studies and data and research shows these things work to get information through the little cycle we just talked about. So I'll just list these quickly here. Analyzing your learners and their current knowledge, and then of course designing training to match the current knowledge and fill the gap. Writing learning objectives and using content based on those objectives. Separating your training up into small chunks. Providing information in various ways. Starting your training by awakening that prior knowledge on a topic. Telling stories, using conversational language, and including referring to people in the second person using the word you, which is more important than you might imagine. Keeping it short, being brief, which goes along with chunking. Using examples and non-examples, and asking people to categorize correctly into examples and non-examples. Giving demonstrations and letting people practice. And along with that, providing feedback on the practice to help them identify their weak points and get better quickly. There's a great book about that called something called Deliberate Practice by Anders Ericsson. It's called Peak, the Science of Expertise. Reflection, asking people after training to think back on it. Elaboration, asking people to put the training into their own words and maybe explain it to somebody else. Over time, asking people to retrieve information that you covered in training, hopefully long enough that they've already started to begin to forget it. And that when they're faced with the issue of having forgotten it, and they have to kind of grind mentally to retrieve that information, that strengthens those neural connections we talked about, and ultimately it makes the learning stronger and the memory stronger. So that's an idea called a desirable difficulty. It was difficult for your learner, but it was desirable because it increases retention over time. And one of the best ways to get that retrieval is through spaced practice, where you don't do training as one and done, but you do it multiple times over time, asking people to retrieve, asking people to apply. And there's a distinction between retrieval and application and simply recall, where they're essentially just regurgitating. So have them retrieve it, which is actually summoning it up on their own, and apply it, as opposed, for example, to just recognizing exactly what you said in training in a multiple choice question. So beyond the scope to go into detail, but this is where you get your bang for buck. It's really worth checking this stuff out. If you want to know some learning researchers, Dr. Will Thalheimer, Dr. Patty Shank, Julie Dirksen, and a lot more. Clark Quinn, all great information and great sources of information on this stuff. In addition, the Convergence Training blog has a couple blog posts, and more than a couple on this kind of stuff. One on evidence-based training, one on learning myths, like the idea of learning styles. There's no data to suggest that designing training for learning styles is helpful. Feel free to check this out.
All right, Jeff, so we've used this term a little bit already, but can you tell us more about blended learning?
Yeah, and this is changing over time. The definition has been changing over time, and now when we're moving to scenarios where people are working remotely, we're being forced to think about it differently as a result as well. But traditionally, what blended learning has meant is doing instructor-led training with online training. And then over time, and there's research that shows that's beneficial, and there are a lot of reasons for it. One of it is the variation we talked about earlier. The other, I suspect, is just the repetition or the spaced practice. But there are probably other reasons, and I'm not sure if I know all of them why it's good. But research shows it's good, including that mix of instructor-led training and online training. But now in a world where you might have to focus at least maybe for the coming months or maybe year on more online training, you can start thinking about blending different kind of things that happen online, like an e-learning course, a PDF, and a webinar or a video. So blended learning, again, is just, you can just think of this as mixing and matching your training delivery methods. Here's a study from the US Department of Energy. I wrote energy, I apologize, it's education. Learning outcomes was larger in studies contrasting conditions that blended elements of online and face-to-face with conditions taught purely face-to-face. So benefit from blended learning. Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark's research, blended learning environments are more effective than pure classroom or pure digital. Dr. Will Thalheimer, who I talked about earlier, blended learning using both online and classroom instruction creates the largest benefits. So there's a clear benefit to blended learning. And a lot of these are on that earlier definition of instructor-led and online, but the general lesson applies to mixing and matching of various types of training. So I just want to give some ideas when you're thinking about how to create your blend of things to think about. And one of the first things I'd recommend is don't just think about training. And in fact, maybe before you think about training, think about, can I create performance support? For those of you who out there who don't know what performance support is, can you get the information to the worker right when he or she needs it on the job? So that might be an old paper checklist. This might be a digital manual or a how-to video. But whatever it is, you're getting information right to the person when they need it. And a lot of times that's a lot more effective than training. You don't have to hope that people remember something from training that happened last January. They can just summon up the information right then. So there's a lot of research into performance support. I recommend you check that out. We write about it. A lot of times you'll also see it referred to as workplace learning or job aids or workflow learning, I'm sorry. But I would consider, if you can, when can I make performance support instead of training? And then, yeah, training in addition. So that's one way to think about blending. Another way to think about blending is a model called the 70-20-10. Now, these numbers relate to percentages, and the percentages aren't accurate. There's no data. So let's ignore that issue. And in fact, some people are trying to rebrand this the 3 E's: experience, exposure, and education. But as a trainer, a lot of times we focus on formal assigned training. I'm going to create training in whatever delivery format. I'm going to assign it to you. You have to take it, and so on. But that may not be where workers learn most of what they know on the job. And in fact, there are lots of reasons to think that people learn more from informal learning on the job. So maybe directly from experience, like just by doing things on their own, but also by talking with their coworkers. And these days there's a lot of, just Googling. So in addition to creating formal assigned training, which is still a noble and good thing to do, it's still beneficial, maybe you should be thinking, how can I facilitate informal learning at my workplace so that people can more effectively learn from their own experience, so that they can learn more from their coworkers, so that they can share what they've learned with their coworkers. as opposed to purely focusing on the formal assigned training. Another way to think about blending, and again, there's a great series of articles right now by Dr. Patty Shank looking at the benefit, how to use synchronous and asynchronous training. I'd recommend doing a Google search for that, or you can email me. But there's some real benefits to each of these things. You know, when is it beneficial to do asynchronous training, which means the person's completing training on his or her own, not in a group? And when is it beneficial to do synchronous training? We're doing it together, we're collaborating. And asynchronous training provides a lot of opportunity for people who maybe train at different paces. They want to practice on their own without kind of feeling nervous about doing it in front of people. And research also shows it provides a lot more opportunity for deep processing and deep learning. So there's a lot of benefit to delivering stuff asynchronously, including, you know, videos, but also the kind of humble PDF and PowerPoint. E-learning courses are an example. And then when is it beneficial to get together in a group environment for discussions, collaborations, case studies, role playing? That's synchronous. So this is a really fertile ground for you to think when you're thinking about your training plan, is when is it beneficial to be asynchronous and when is it beneficial to be synchronous? Another model, and this is from Dr. Ruth Colvin Clark and also Merrill, is what am I trying to teach people? And that can inform you about what kind of training activities you want people to complete and what kind of training delivery methods you need in order to get those training activities. So we have 6 different kinds of content here: facts, concepts, processes, procedures, principles, and then what's called fire transfer, where you take something you learned and apply it in an entirely different context. We have a lengthy article about this for the Virgin Training blog, but just a couple of highlights here. Facts. All humans are really bad at simply memorizing facts. So maybe if it's not necessary to include facts in training, you can use that performance support we talked about. And I don't care if it's paper-based or if it's a digital checklist, but that's something to think about right off the bat. Processes and procedures. People learn, research shows people learn those very well, especially processes from video. So if you can have some kind of video to explain a process, great. If you can have a procedure that begins to teach the process, then you're going to need some kind of demonstration and practice afterward. That's good as well. Applying principles amongst other things. So a principle would be, for example, these are the principles of lean manufacturing, apply them at your workplace. So it's much more complicated than simply a procedure, or like you've gone to culinary school, make a great meal. So this involves development of expertise, and it involves a lot of practice and just exposure over time. And so you can do this kind of thing in a face-to-face like role play, but that's a nice use for e-learning, where you can have someone run through these simulations over and over and over again, or virtual reality, for example. Bob Mosher and Conrad Gottfredson have a great moments of need model: learning for the first time, learning more, remembering and applying, when things go wrong and when things change. So again, if you're learning things for the first time, maybe you'll use a normal blend. Maybe learning more, you'll use micro-learning dripped out over time through mobile devices. Remembering and applying in particular, maybe, again, we're back to performance support. When things go wrong, maybe you would need, maybe something went wrong quickly and you need to inform people that are widely distributed. So again, maybe something online will be beneficial for that. When things change, maybe you're going to need to come back and have a larger discussion about that. And then a model here that I borrowed from an L&D professional in Australia, Arun Pradhan. And this is his artwork on the right, and we've kind of simplified this on the left. But he has the real point I want to make here, less so than the actual individual details, is this idea that you can think of training not as a one and done experience, but building a campaign over time. And on the left, you can have some things you're doing before the worker actually performs it on the job. And then in the middle, while workers are performing it on the job the first time or first times. And then below that, after, people have had a little bit of time to work with it on the job. And we kind of broke it out here a little bit more. So engage, that might be sending an email to people, letting them know training is coming. This is what it's about. And this is why you should care, to establish the what's in it for me. Below that, prime people. So this is the initial training of how they're going to do it. Maybe use that some kind of blended training, make safe, deliberate practice. Apply when people are doing it for the first time, support them while they're doing it, give them just enough resources, give them adequate feedback. So they're getting coached on whether or not they're doing this. And this is probably where the trainer is going to work together with the supervisor or manager so that the workers are getting the correct support on the job. Connect a worker with other coworkers so they can continue talking about the skill and knowledge and continue learning together, which is an easy thing to get, but this is that social learning from the 70-20-10 model. Have people reflect on it. Build in a reflection prompt. What did I learn that was helpful? What seems to be giving me trouble? How does this connect to that? And then do what you can to embed or help workers establish habits, practices, and provide ongoing support. So this is a nice model when you think about building a campaign over time.
That's really good stuff, Jeff. Thank you so much. So what are some types of activities, when we talk about activities, that we conduct to be successful really in our training?
Yeah, okay, great. So we've talked about these, but I want to just give you guys a couple tips about using each of them. And people were saying like, I guess one of our polls, not a great deal of interest in PDFs or PowerPoints, or there was some interest in video. And I pointed out in particular that videos can be a great way to learn process and procedures, but I would not discard PDFs and PowerPoints. And one of the nice things about all these PDF, PowerPoint, video is they provide opportunities for asynchronous learning. So I can learn, at my own pace. It's very possible, and in fact, likely that Carol and Jeff read PDFs at different speeds, and Carol's works for Carol and Jeff's works for Jeff's, and that's all fine. So if you just need to deliver information, these might be great ways to deliver information. I talked as well about the benefits of visual learning. Obviously, you'll get that, in a video very well. One tip though, if you're delivering information this way, it's probably unlikely that all of your coworkers are going to do the kind of deep active learning they need to do while they're reading a PDF to really start to create that deep learning process we talked about. So don't just go with a PDF or a PowerPoint, but build something into it, even though it's still an asynchronous activity that causes the person to have to reflect. Ask them directly in a PDF. Take a moment and think about this. What would you do in this scenario? Start to embed that kind of idea. Either it's in the PDF or it's in the next activity, which might be an e-learning course. But there's definitely a lot of value to these, and it's easy to overlook these. Webinars, what we're doing now. And a lot of people are making a distinction between virtual online learning and kind of emergency or crisis response learning. And obviously, as soon as the pandemic hit, we all went into that emergency mode, which was fine. And a lot, half of America, including my mom and dad, figured out how to use Zoom or something similar. I don't have any allegiance to any of the webinar platforms. And a lot of trainers started using webinars too. Webinars can be good, but in a lot of ways, they're like a PDF or PowerPoint or a video. They're largely effective for broadcasting information. Now, webinars do give you the opportunity to, maybe if you have video on, to look people face to face and see if they look confused. You might have a chat feature. You might get a little information on that. But think of webinars primarily as an information broadcasting tool. And then I'll get back to that in just a moment. And here's where I'll get back to it. Now, you can use that exact same platform, that webinar platform, whatever it is, and most or all of them have features in them that allow you to take an information broadcast webinar and turn it into a deep learning, active processing learning experience. And that's what we call a virtual classroom or virtual instructor-led training. So I guess to make a couple distinctions, a webinar and virtual classrooms are different because in virtual classrooms, you're embedding a lot of those, if you will, active learning methods we talked about earlier, or active instructional methods. If you're an experienced instructor-led trainer, a virtual classroom is like and unlike what you've done. So as an instructor-led classroom trainer, you designed your training and you built in activities so that you're not just a sage on a stage, you're not spraying and praying, but you're facilitating learning by guiding your workers through active learning experiences. So the virtual classroom is very similar to that. You're still going to have to design that learning to create those active learning experiences so that people really do comprehend, retain, and later apply information on the job. So in that way, it's the same. However, it's not a one-to-one transformation or translation. So you can't just take the PowerPoint that you use for instructor-led training, put it in a webinar tool, and say you've got a virtual classroom. What you need to do instead is use the additional tools in the webinar platform to create a virtual classroom. Now on the right, I have a picture of a little kind of translation checklist, if you will. This is created by a woman named Jacinta Penn in New Zealand. She works for a company called WorkBright, and she's kind of saying, these are on the left, these are the things you were trying to do in class. These are the ways to do it in something like Zoom. I also just had a webinar with a woman named Shannon Tipton, who's an expert in this, and that'll be available at our blog next week. And just a couple things to call out that I partly learned from all of these people, including Shannon. At times during a virtual classroom, you can have your, well, I guess when you come in, use the chat feature immediately so that people start to realize, oh, this is going to be interactive. I'm going to be expected to chat. Start with the audio off for everybody, but you can later turn audio on when it's necessary if people are going to do Q&A. Start with your video on, and then consider turning it off at a certain point. And keep in mind the bandwidth issues. Video chews up bandwidth, so you might need to go without that. As you're asking questions during your webinar, as opposed to just talking, but asking questions, you can there are features like hit the green check button if you agree, hit the red X button if you disagree. And now you're getting, in the same way in class where you're asking people to self-assess their learning, now they're self-assessing and they're interacting with you. Couple other, there are features in these tools, the virtual classrooms. Use breakout rooms, use whiteboards, use screen drawing, use screen sharing. So remember, don't just lead them through a passive webinar. Instead, build a psychologically and instructionally active virtual classroom using these other tools. And this is probably going to be one of those, if you are an e-learning designer or an instructor-led training, this is going to be an increasingly valuable skill, knowing how to lead virtual classrooms effectively. And I'd really recommend, with the start we just gave you, digging in to learn more. And there are probably certificate programs out there. I myself am learning more. Next, yes, you can build an e-learning course or buy e-learning courses. The e-learning course is the kind of the standard online learning thing. They're delivered through the learning management systems. A couple things for you to know if this is all new to you. They are created with products called e-learning authoring tools. There are a lot of e-learning authoring tools on the market. They're probably all pretty good. I don't have a favorite. The three basics to know about are Adobe Captivate, Articulate's product 360, and Trivantis has a product called Lectora. They were just bought out by the e-learning brothers. You use your e-learning authoring tool to create a zip folder at the end. You can start with a PowerPoint and build on that. You publish it in different formats. The different formats, some of the most common ones are SCORM and something new called Experience API or XAPI. And you need to publish your e-learning course in the same format that your LMS will accept. You can make your own using these e-learning authoring tools. The prices vary, but I think you can get them for like $1,300, and they're free 30-day trials, and they're not that hard to learn. You can buy off-the-shelf e-learning from any number of producers, and you could have custom stuff made. And a lot of times organizations offer them as well. So One tip I got from a learning researcher named Connie Malamet during this COVID-19 thing is, hey, if you're going to start building e-learning, don't worry about putting a lot of content in right now. Use the e-learning to create practice opportunities. And I think that's really smart. And then you can build on that over time. But you could have a video or a PowerPoint or a PDF to distribute information and use the e-learning for that practice. Again, we've got a lot of additional helpful information for you. We did a lot of research or interviews with experts on this. Here are some blog articles and some URLs. Watch out for the Shannon Tipton one on virtual training coming out next week as well.
Okay, Jeff. So as we kind of wrap up here, and perhaps most importantly, can you just share some of the tips that would get us started with everything?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, a lot of us are going to be new to this or new to parts of it. You don't need to be perfect, and don't halt until you can get perfection, until you know everything, until you're the best. Go ahead and get started. You know, good is good enough. On the flip side, though, especially if your organization, if you're entirely new to the online learning, if your organization is new to it, and in particular, if your workers are new to it, don't take what I just said as license to just throw out any old garbage. I mean, it's just a waste of your time. It's a waste of your organization's time and money, the workers' time, obviously. But in addition, if that's the intro at your organization to online learning, you've now killed your hopes for online learning in the future. So good is good, garbage is not. You don't have to be perfect, but don't just throw out anything. And to that point, so one way to do it is to start small. A couple of the tips we talked about already. You know, this is probably, if you don't have a learning management system today at your organization, today is probably not the day to buy a brand new learning management system. For the time being, you can use simpler methods that you're currently using to deliver training online. Email, text, SharePoint, something like Trello. You know, down the line, you can evaluate a learning management system and get one, but you know, start small on that. Don't create online training for everything. Create it for a few critical things, and we'll talk about that. If you're creating, you know, focus probably on not webinars, but on virtual learning and how you can create virtual classrooms. I'm sorry, that's what I mean. Using that webinar tool and using the features we talked about for chat, red X's and green checks and breakout rooms and collaborative learning. That's probably a good place to start. If you're going to start making your own e-learning courses, you know, maybe take that tip from Connie Malamet and use them just primarily for practice, you know, as opposed to content delivery. And then you can build all those things over time. A lot of people are new to this. So just as my mom and dad needed help figuring out how to use Zoom, all of our workers who are new to this are going to need help learning how to do this as well. And that goes for you as well. If you're new to virtual instructor-led training or those virtual classrooms, you're going to need practice and you're going to need help as well. So remember, this has been decentering for everybody. Everyone's going to need help. Help those people and be patient and supportive with them and with yourself, I should say. In terms of starting small again, what should you start with first? Obviously, critical training for job tasks that are high risk, training for job tasks that are very complex or difficult, things that are very common and necessary, compliance training and onboarding, you know, which is already a pretty good sized list. But if you focus on this stuff, you know, maybe just leave some training undone for a while. And again, maybe you don't have to create training because you can help people learn from their coworkers as well. This is a good list of 6 things to focus on initially. And with that, Carol, we're all done. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we did have quite a few questions come in, Jeff. Thank you. And I just wanted to say also, I mean, I do appreciate the tidbit about you talking about your parents learning to use Zoom. I mean, I've had a similar experience, and it's just the fact that they're very smart people, but a lot of us are super new to this, and I feel like I should almost share the presentation with them as well. So anyway, I digress.
Well, It is not just my parents. I have had to learn a lot of things about Zoom, and I'm still learning as well.
Of course, yeah. All right, so one question came in from Tracy, and I think this is an important one. How do we get staff to buy in for online training taking over as a primary learning solution? So maybe if they were used to strictly instructor-led training, how do you get buy-in from your employees?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think the first is it's probably not a bad idea to just explain why. I think probably I'm not a change management expert, but I think probably a fundamental rule of change management is to explain the purpose of the change, right? And if I can't do instructor-led training because you might die, and therefore I'm going to online training, you might get some additional buy-in for that. Or because I can't give you instructor-led training because you're not at the office or at the workplace. But I think other things are making sure the training is relevant and that it's going to actually help people on the job and that they see it's going to help them. So, part of that is just making the case to workers. But another part is maybe we all need to up our game and make sure that we're really creating training that's relevant, that helps our workers, that we're using the kind of evidence-based training methods we talked about, that we later evaluate our training and make sure it's really working. And then I think this is another answer is just, in addition to being a trainer, you might need to be a bit of a marketer. And that might mean sending out emails, getting people excited about online training and telling them some of the benefits and showing like some cool samples and so on. So I don't know if that's, and then, I think another thing is that if people resist, why? Sometimes it's just because it's new, but there's totally legitimate reasons to resist online training if I don't know how to do it. And so again, I think some of that answer is going to get down to making sure you understand the objections and addressing those objections. And if part of it is like a fear of online learning because I don't know how to use a web browser yet, you're going to have to help people through that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jeff. We've had a kind of similar question come in from Carlos and Raquel. They're just kind of asking to talk a little bit more about an LMS, like maybe starting with just a basic definition and then maybe our Vector Solutions offerings.
Sure. So LMS, for everybody out there who doesn't know, stands for Learning Management System. It's the industry standard way to deliver, assign, track, and report on online training. But it handles more than just online training. So you can manage all of your instructor-led training and so on. Basic features are the ability to create a user record for all of your employees. You can import or even create training content directly. You can import your PowerPoint, your PDF. You can import your self-created e-learning course. You can make things like surveys and online quizzes and checklists. You can assign all of that, and you can create an activity for instructor-led training, a classroom session. You can assign all that to different units of your workforce, from the entire organization down to your forklift operators or to Carol. You can deliver that training online, notify workers that they've been assigned training, remind people of a training due date, set training due dates, see if people are done or not done. If training has to be taken every year, you can kind of set an expiration date and have it be automatically reassigned and everyone's notified. You can track training completion, you can run reports, and you can store all those completion records. And then on top of that, you can do a lot of other things. So that's what a learning management system does. The company I work for, our parent company, is, and there's like 700 learning management systems on the market. Our parent company, Vector Solutions, makes a learning management system called Journey. And Carol, is that what Red Vector is? You guys are moving toward having everybody on Journey, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so Carol's company, Red Vector, they're moving toward everyone to Journey. That's the latest and greatest from them. My company, Convergence Training, you can get Journey, or you can use the Convergence Enterprise LMS. all of these LMSs have slightly different features, and you know, you can talk with someone in sales or something to find out what would be best for you. But we have a variety of offerings, and that's what the LMS in general does. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And kind of continuing on with an LMS, like, you know, so after, say, an employee takes a course in an LMS, what then, if they take it out into the real world, you know, what would your suggestions be for taking that next step and applying what's been learned?
Yeah, so, you know, like, so this gets back to that model that I kind of copped from R and Pradhan, where I'm talking about building a campaign. And but all sorts of learning researchers will tell you this, like you really shouldn't be doing learning as a one and done activity. And so to try to break that down a little bit more without going to great length, a couple things to think about are after that initial training, people are going to be inclined to forget it, especially if they don't use it very quickly. So one thing to think about is after training, provide an opportunity for people to really do it on the job almost immediately. A second thing to think about is providing the kind of spaced practice or spaced learning we talked about. So, and you know, microlearning could be a great way to do that. Like just send me like a week later a prompt asking me to apply this information and make a correct decision in a little 1 minute video, and then make a decision at the end where I'm actually being forced to apply that. So provide the training, give people immediate opportunity to apply it on the job, use additional spaced practice over time. And then remember that part of, you know, build in the kind of things that R and Pradhan's model talked about, like a prompt for reflection, a way to get together with coworkers to create a community of practice, a way to get back with trainers and supervisors to ask additional questions and maybe look for changes or improvements. There's the behavioral economics theory of nudge. You know, what training is ultimately trying to do is create behavior change, right? And behavior change is hard. That's why training is hard. And so maybe sometimes instead of creating training and asking people to change their behavior, you can nudge people to perform the desired behavior on the job. So that's an interesting idea, is nudge. And then last, just, you know, support through managers. How can you help people apply the information on the job? And part of that is the kind of feedback and support we talked about, and part of that is the performance support we talked about. You know, don't make me remember something if you can just give me a checklist. So hopefully that helps a little bit, and feel free to write an email to me if you want more information on that.
Okay, Jeff, some of the resources we talked about, the books and things, maybe we can just together round up, you know, Dr. Ruth Colvin, Patty Schenk, a couple of people are asking for the resources we've mentioned and some of the books.
Yeah, so we'll try to get that into the follow-up email, but in addition, please feel free to email me. Let me, here's my email on the screen now. Hopefully that's visible. But if you go to the Convergence Training blog and for example, look at the article that we referred in this webinar on evidence-based training methods, every learning researcher I've stolen everything I know from, all with credit, by the way, are listed there. But yeah, feel free to email me. Feel free to the Convergence Training blog. We talk about this kind of stuff a lot. We'll try to get this stuff into the follow-up email as well. Connect with me on LinkedIn, and then notice whose stuff I share. And those are generally the leading professionals in the industry, and I recommend, you know, connect with me and then connect with them and follow them.
Great, thank you, Jeff. This was another one that was kind of a repeat, so I wanted to ask more of an opinion, but do you see online training taking over traditional training, you know, post-COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I'm flattered you ask. I'm not sure that I'm the world's biggest sage, and my crystal ball is pretty fuzzy for the future. I certainly understand the question, and I think it's, I would be surprised if this pandemic does not lead to some change that leads to an increased usage of online training or other kinds of training. You know, I think this transition from an exclusive reliance on instructor-led or classroom training to online has been going on for a while and has been accelerating, and now, so some people are holding out for any number of reasons, some good and maybe some not good. But, we've all been forced to have to transition to one degree or another, even Carol and Jeff's moms learn how to use Zoom, right? So people,
That's right.
one of the hurdles is gone. Like, we're figuring out how to do it. We're figuring out it's not that hard. We're figuring out it can have benefits. And, we're going to be, I don't know how long this is going to go on, this period we're in, maybe until there's a vaccine and it can be manufactured and distributed. So maybe we're talking 18 months. I don't know. We've got 18 months to figure out that Zoom is not that scary. People like you and I have 18 months, not just to figure out how to use Zoom, but how to figure out how to be effective virtual instructors. And over time, this might become a habit, and that's one of the big drivers is behavior change is habit, maybe more than, training. And so we've got 18 months to develop habits, and it might, after that period of time, I think it's very possible that online training will have gobbled up more of that. If you think of it as a pie chart, will be a bigger slice of that pie.
Really good, Jeff. Thank you so much. I believe we've covered our questions. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. There's certainly a lot going on in the world, and we do appreciate your time. And certainly, Jeff, thank you. I think the information for me personally has been very helpful.
Well, thanks, Carol. Thanks to everybody out there. Again, hang tight and we'll get a follow-up email to you. Please do email me if you're interested in more information. Follow me on LinkedIn. Stay safe and healthy during the pandemic, and best wishes and good luck with your online training.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.